For 3,000 years, ancient Egypt ran the most successful business the world had ever seen. The product, eternal life. The customers, everyone. The ancient Egyptians didn't just believe in the afterlife, they industrialized it. Mummification was a real economy, with price tiers, quality control, skilled labor, and a supply chain that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. Priests ran the workshops, merchants imported the materials, scribes sold the sacred texts, and tomb robbers recycled the profits. In this episode of Empires and Economics, the three price tiers of the embalming industry, the temple workshops that turned priests into funeral providers, the global trade in linen, resin, and natron, the economics of grave goods and tomb robbery, and the tourists who turned mummies into an ancient attraction. This is the story of mummies, how Egypt turned death into the biggest industry of the ancient world. I'm your host, and this is Empires and Economics. To understand the mummy economy, start with geography. Egypt sat on the Nile, a narrow ribbon of farmland surrounded by desert. The desert mattered. It was dry, and dry air preserved whatever was buried in it. But the Egyptians didn't rely on the desert alone. They built a nationwide industry around the preservation of the body, and they priced it like any other luxury market. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt around 450 BC, described the industry in detail. He recorded 3 methods of embalming, sold at 3 different prices. The most expensive could cost a talent of silver, a staggering sum, enough to buy a farm. The cheapest cost only a modest fee. The afterlife, in other words, was a market with tiers. You could buy the premium package, the middle package, or the budget package, and the quality of your eternity depended on your wallet. The premium method was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. First, the embalmers removed the brain through the nostrils using a hooked tool, a procedure they performed with skill and care. Then they made a small incision in the side of the body and removed the internal organs. The organs were cleaned, perfumed, and stored in special jars called canopic jars, protected because the Egyptians believed the deceased would need them in the afterlife. The body cavity was then washed with palm wine and packed with fragrant spices, myrrh, cassia, and other expensive aromatics. Finally, the body was covered in natron, a natural salt, and left to dry for 70 days. When the drying was complete, the body was washed again, anointed with oils, and wrapped in hundreds of meters of fine linen bandages, with amulets tucked between the layers. The result was a mummy that could survive for millennia. The price matched the craft. The middle tier was cheaper, and it used a clever trick. Instead of removing the organs by hand, the embalmers injected cedar oil into the body cavity through a tube, plugged the opening, and let the oil do the work. The oil dissolved the internal organs, and the body was then dried in natron in the usual way. The budget tier was simpler still. The body was rinsed with a purging solution, dried in natron for 70 days, and returned to the family. No spices, no luxury oils, no long ceremony, just the essentials. Herodotus noted an even darker economy at the bottom of the market. The cheapest handlers sometimes sold the organs they removed to medical or magical buyers, or used them in rituals. Nothing in the death industry went to waste. The 3-tier system was brilliant economics. It captured wealthy elites, the middle class, and even the poor, all paying for the same product in different packages. Who ran this industry? The priests. Mummification was the business of the temple. The workshops, called the waybet, meaning the pure place, were usually attached to temples, and the embalmers were priests who served in rotating shifts. The sacred knowledge of embalming was guarded and passed down within the priestly class. The temple model was a vertical monopoly. The priests held the religious knowledge, controlled the workshops, trained the embalmers, and administered the rites. If you wanted eternal life, you went through the priesthood and you paid. Payment was flexible. Wealthy families paid in silver or gold. Middle-class families paid in grain, oil, cattle, or linen. The temple took everything. The economy of the afterlife ran on barter as much as on cash. The labor force was specialized. There were the terakutes, the embalmers who performed the preservation. There were the kolkites, the workers who handled the bodies and the bandaging. And there was a man called the parashistis, the cutter, who made the first incision. The cutter's job was essential but stigmatized. Ancient writers like Diodorus tell us that the cutter was ritually cursed and pelted with stones after making the incision because he had wounded a human body. He was paid well for his social sacrifice. Around the workshop moved the professional mourners, hired women who wailed, tore their hair, and threw dust on their heads. Diodorus says the mourners were hired for the funeral, whether or not anyone in the family was actually grieving. Emotion, too, was a service you could buy. The death industry of Egypt had a division of labor as sophisticated as any factory in the ancient world. The mummy business was a heavy consumer of raw materials, and the supply chain stretched across the empire. First, natron, the salt that dried the bodies. The best source was Wadi Natron, northwest of Cairo, whose name literally means the Valley of Natron. The lakes produced a natural mix of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, perfect for desiccating the body over 70 days. The salt was collected, packed onto donkeys, and shipped down the Nile to the embalming workshops. Then there was linen. A royal mummy could be wrapped in hundreds of meters of bandages, and less elaborate burials still used many meters of cloth. Linen was one of Egypt's great industries, made from flax grown across the delta. The demand from the afterlife alone kept entire villages spinning and weaving. The most expensive inputs came from abroad. Resin and aromatic gums, used to fill the body cavity and seal the linen, were imported from Punt, the legendary land at the southern end of the Red Sea, and from Syria. Bitumen, used in some periods to blacken and seal the wrappings, was imported from the shores of the Dead Sea. Cedar wood for elite coffins came from Lebanon. These weren't small shipments. Modern studies of royal mummies have found them packed with resin. In some cases, the cost of the imported resin exceeded the cost of all the local labor combined. The afterlife was an import-driven luxury industry. Every stage of the supply chain generated income: the miners, the weavers, the sailors, the merchants, the customs officials, and the carters. Millions of people, over thousands of years, were employed by the business of death. The mummy itself was only the centerpiece. Around it grew an entire economy of grave goods. First, the coffin. The simplest burials used reed mats or plain wooden boxes. The elite bought nested anthropoid coffins, carved, painted, and gilded, some made from imported Lebanese cedar. A great burial could require several coffins, one inside another, each one a major work of craft. Then came the ornaments. Amulets of fiancage, stone or gold, were placed among the bandages, each with a magical purpose. Masks covered the face, from painted cartonnage for the middle class to solid gold for the very richest. The most famous, Tutankhamun's death mask, is 10 kilograms of pure gold, a fortune that still exists today. And there was the literary economy. The Book of the Dead, the collection of spells to guide the soul through the underworld, was a commercial product. Scribes produced copies in different quality tiers, elaborate illustrated scrolls for the wealthy, simple text-only versions for the poor. You could order ahead and have your name written into the spells, custom-made for your afterlife. The same logic drove the Ushabti, the small working figurines buried with the dead to perform labor in the hereafter. Wealthy Egyptians were buried with hundreds of Ushabtis, often mass-produced in molds. Tutankhamun took nearly 400 of them to his grave. This was the ancient world's first mass production, identical figurines made on assembly lines, sold by the dozen. By the end of the New Kingdom, the economics of the grave had reached every level of society. Even the poorest families scraped together amulets, a plain coffin, and a rented copy of the rituals. The afterlife was democratized, but it was never free. Where there is concentrated wealth, there is theft, and the mummy economy's dark twin was the tomb robbery industry. The royal tombs were packed with gold, jewelry, and precious goods, and from almost the moment they were sealed, they were robbed, often with inside help. The great tomb robbery papyri of the Ramesside period record the trials of gangs who broke into royal tombs and the investigations that followed. The testimony is striking. The robbers included temple priests, officials, and even the very guards appointed to protect the necropolis. The scale was industrial. One papyrus records a gang cutting through rock, opening a royal burial, and stripping the mummy of its gold amulets and jewelry, then melting the gold down into ingots for resale. The precious metal disappeared into the market, and the tomb was sealed again to hide the crime. The economics of tomb robbery are simple. A royal burial could contain more value than a province. The risk was real. Convicted robbers were executed, but the reward was overwhelming, and because the gold was melted down, it was nearly impossible to trace. The Egyptian state fought back, relocating royal mummies into hidden caches. The great cache at Deir el-Bahri, found in the late 19th century, contained the mummies of more than 40 kings and queens, gathered centuries after their deaths by priests trying to save them from the robbers. The irony is delicious. The priests themselves documented the thefts in papyri that scholars still study today. The business of the afterlife created a business of the after-death, and recycling was its engine. The mummy economy outlived the pharaohs. The Greeks and Romans were fascinated by Egyptian mummies, and they came as tourists. Herodotus came, watched, and wrote the account we rely on today. Later, Diodorus and Strabo described the embalming trade in detail. Roman tourists visited the pyramids, the labyrinths, and the temples, carving their names into monuments, the ancient equivalent of a review on social media. The tourists brought coin. Guides, boatmen, innkeepers, and souvenir sellers all fed on the stream of visitors. In the Roman period, wealthy residents of Egypt, including Romans, adopted mummification themselves. The famous Fayum portraits, lifelike paintings placed over the faces of the wrapped, show a multicultural elite buying into the Egyptian afterlife industry. And the industry never died, it simply changed form. Modern museums acquire, study, and display mummies. Tourists still pay to see them. In the 19th century, European artists ground up real mummies to make a brown pigment called mummy brown. The afterlife literally sold as paint. Victorian aristocrats held unwrapping parties as entertainment, and today's physicians have become the newest practitioners of the ancient trade. CT scanners, originally built for living patients, now reveal the secrets of the mummies without unwrapping them. Studies of mummified bodies have documented the health of ancient Egyptians, from arterial disease to dental problems, turning the embalmed into the world's most ancient medical records. The embalmers who preserved these bodies did more than sell eternity. They built the first great archive of human health. The lesson of the mummy economy is that belief, organized into industry, can run for millennia. The Egyptians built a three-tier market for eternity, ran it through the temples, fed it with imported luxury goods, and protected it from a thriving black market of robbers. They turned the sacred into the commercial, and the commercial into the sacred. Millions of mummies, thousands of years. One continuous business. The pharaohs are gone, their temples have crumbled, but the mummy economy, the idea that the dead are good for business, has never stopped paying dividends. Because in the end, the most successful product in ancient Egypt was not gold, not grain, and not the pyramids. It was a promise of the afterlife, wrapped in linen and sold to an entire civilization at 3 different price points. And that, remarkably, is the economics of eternity.